I'm always happy to talk to our guest. He's one of the foremost journalists of this era. He has won the Pulitzer Prize, the I.F. Stone Izzy Award, and the George Polk Award. But more importantly, he founded the Hope Shelter for Rescued Dogs. He recently resigned over censorship from the online news publication The Intercept, an organization he helped found. Please welcome Glenn Greenwald and his dogs. Hi, Glenn. How are you?
Hey, Jimmy. Great to be with you. Your pineapples look fantastic.
Oh, boy, he's getting fresh already. Okay, so
I'm so ready.
Now, Glenn, ever since the hysteria over Russiagate, there's been a culture developing that calls for internet censorship. We even see figures on the corporate left calling for censorship, pleading for the unaccountable authority of faceless Silicon Valley employees to protect us from our own thoughts and the thoughts of others. Can you tell me, how did we get here?
What's so interesting, Jimmy, is that Facebook and Google and Twitter never wanted the power, the responsibility to regulate or discourse or censor, not because they're good, benevolent people who believe in freedom, but because it wasn't in their interest to take on this responsibility. The model they wanted to implement was the one that, say, AT&T has, which is we're just a content neutral platform. We have no responsibility for the information or the ideas that go over our wire. Nobody, for example, expects that if Alex Jones calls Milo Yiannopoulos and they have a conference call, that AT&T is going to intervene and cut off their service, because AT&T is a content neutral platform. That's what Facebook and Google and Twitter wanted to be, because that way they would make more money and they wouldn't have this responsibility. The reason they started having to censor is because journalists began demanding that they do so. They have employees at the New York Times and CNN and NBC whose only job is to troll the internet, looking for people who violate the rules. They're like little middle school tattletale hall monitors. And they say, why is Facebook giving voice to this person? Why is Twitter not yet banning this person? And they've created this public demand that has foisted upon these companies not just the ability, but the duty to censor. And just last week, they had a bunch of tech executives like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Alphabet, the parent company of Google, before a Senate committee. And Ed Markey, the Democrat from Massachusetts, who the left, the actual left, like the little Sunrise Movement kids and all those, like got behind to defeat Joe Kennedy III, said to Mark Zuckerberg, our problem with you is not that you're not censoring enough. It's not that you're censoring too much. It's that you're not censoring enough. Here's a post we think you should take off the internet. And here's another one we think you should ban. This is what they're going to do in power. They're going to pressure these social media companies even more. And if people on the left think that this is only going to be aimed at the right, you're fucking stupid. The whole idea of censorship is to eliminate any dissenting voices that challenge institutions of power. And they hate the left every bit as much as they hate the right. They've convinced people to support this on the left by saying, oh, look, we're going to only do it against Alex Jones. And it's already starting against the left, and it's only going to get worse.
It's amazing that the people on the left still, to this day, I just had a confrontation on Twitter with a lefty journalist who still stands by calling for censorship, for, with no adversarial process, just letting Mark Zuckerberg censor someone without anything. And even to this day, as they're being censored, they'll still stand by their call for censoring someone else. Like, the problem is it's like, do they really not understand, Glenn, that you don't get to pick and choose that who gets censored? Once you start censoring, it's out of your hands, and that it's going to come back on you, especially if you're on the left and you challenge the status quo. That's who they're going to use censorship against. How is it that the people on the left don't understand this?
That's always the amazing thing to me about censorship advocates, is this idea that they're going to have this imaginary world where institutions of authority are going to censor benevolently in order to defend the marginalized. It's such a radical misunderstanding of how power operates. Say to a leftist, what do you think of the U.S. government? And they'll say, oh, the U.S. government is authoritarian and fascist. And then you say, like, what do you think of the federal judiciary? And they'll say, oh, it's filled with right-wing law and order judges, because that's who Reagan and Bush and Trump appointed, which is true. And then he's like, what do you think of, tech executives, billionaires in Silicon Valley? And they'll say they're hideous, they're horrible, they're right-wing oligarchs, which is true. And then you say, like, are you in favor of giving those institutions, the ones that you just condemned and denounced as fascist and authoritarian oligarchs, the power to control the internet and regulate? Oh, yes, absolutely. We need to protect the marginalized. Why would you think that that is how they're going to do it? The censorship is always aimed at the marginalized, not the powerful. That's the nature of it. It's a minoritarian right, free speech, because it's always people with minority views who are aimed at censorship. We reported, Jimmy, at the end of 2017, I did actually, not we, that Facebook, when they get requests from the Israeli government to censor or remove pages of Palestinian journalists, Palestinian activists, or just ordinary citizens in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza, on the grounds that they're inciting violence or advocating terrorism, in something like 98.5% of the cases, Facebook complies with the Israeli government's request. Why? Because the Israeli government is powerful and the Palestinians aren't. They never take down Israeli pages, almost never, when Palestinians ask, because Palestinians have no power. These censorship powers are going to be exercised on behalf of the powerful, which right now means the neoliberal order of the Democratic Party, the CIA and NSA, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and the New York Times, kind of Atlantic, NBC, CNN, Axis. That's who's in power. That's the ruling coalition. And anybody who is against them, you or me, on the left or the right, it makes no difference, will be subject to these kinds of constraints, these kind of speech constraints.
And so what do you say to someone, Glenn, because this is what they say to me. They go, well, of course, Twitter and Facebook shouldn't have to wait for a court order to get rid of Alex Jones because the people he was harassing, right, the people at Sandy Hook, and people literally, I've had a journalist say to me that, of course, you shouldn't have to wait for a court before you step in and do something. And I'm like, well, what do you say to that?
Well, I'm sure you guys remember the debates over torture that took place in the second half of the Bush-Cheney years and then into the Obama years, the 2008 election. It was one in which I participated very vigorously. One of the reasons why I started writing about politics was in opposition to the worldwide torture regime the Bush administration had implemented in the name of fighting and stopping terrorism. And so in order to defend torture, what they would do is they would concoct a hypothetical, like an example, like the best example for their case. They would say, imagine we have a terrorist in our custody who has set off a nuclear bomb that if it detonates, is going to kill 2.5 million people in the middle of like New York or Los Angeles or wherever. And the only way you can find out where that bomb is to defuse it is if you torture that person. Do you torture that person or not? That's a hard case, right? Like that's not an easy, you don't just say, no, let the 2 million people die. Torture is always wrong. But the reason why it's such a scumbag way of debating is because you're purposely creating the most extreme hypothetical case and then demanding that a generalized rule be extracted from it. That's never how torture is used. That's like a once in a every 10,000 year scenario at best that you don't use to base rules on. It's the same thing. This is what they'll do. When the government wants to censor, they'll pick out Fred Phelps, who goes to, the funerals of veterans killed in wars or gay people and marches like God hates all, like the most hateful, odious person, or Alex Jones, who says Sandy Hook is a hoax or whatever. And they lure you in, just like those people who were torture advocates tried to do, into saying, yeah, I'm so angry about the particular person to whom you're going to apply this power that I endorse this precedent. I hope you're going to just use it against Alex Jones and not start expanding it outward. But I'm so emotionally charged by the person that you've gotten me to hate that I'm willing to stand behind and cheer for authority. The CIA, the DOJ, Twitter, Google, Facebook. And of course, the next day, they start expanding it outward from Alex Jones to a more mainstream person until it's basically anybody who, people get suspended all the time now. They get demonetized on YouTube. They get suspended for a week. They don't even know why. There's no appeal. It's just an invisible Silicon Valley overlord on whom we now rely to determine whether we have the right to be heard. Who would support that?
I just got in an argument with someone on Twitter who's a journalist who would support that. That's who. Most of the people in journalism who consider themselves on the left would support that. Unfortunately, most of the people on YouTube who I know who are lefties support that. That's who supports that, Glenn. That's what I'm talking about. It's not like we have a group of people who see through this bullshit. It's just like a handful of people who see through it, and everyone else is for this kind of censorship, which is why our country is going into a dark age right now. We have McCarthy. I saw McCarthyism and censorship come from the left. Isn't that's to me the most mind-blowing thing? It's just the left is supposed to be pushing back against that stuff, not pushing it. Isn't that again? Yes, it is amazing, Jimmy. All right.
This is such an important. Let me just quickly add to this because this is such an important point about the left. In 2016, the left scared the shit out of neoliberals when Bernie almost beat the invincible Clinton machine. He almost won. Had the DNC not cheated in documents revealed by WikiLeaks, which is why Julian Assange is now in prison, he would have beaten Hillary Clinton, right? An old Brooklyn Jew who wasn't even a Democrat, who calls himself a socialist, would have taken down the Clinton machine because in the 2008 financial crisis and afterwards, huge numbers of people are identifying as socialists because their towns are boarded up. They have nothing but opioids and, shitty jobs at Amazon and Walmart at the best. They get out of college or even a master's degree with $150,000 in debt and can only get a job for $13 an hour. They have no future. So, of course, they're starting to identify in the most capitalist and richest country in the world as socialists. So the neoliberals are thinking, holy shit, we better do something to co-opt the left, to get rid of this left-wing movement. And what did they do? They invented a fascist monster. Fascism is taking over the United States. So you may hate us, the neoliberals, but if you want to fight fascism, you need to get behind us. You need to cheer the FBI and Bill Kristol and Silicon Valley censorship because we're the only things that can protect you from fascism. And I hear these tough guy liberals all the time saying, what's the point of defeating neoliberalism if we lose to fascism? So they convince people that Trump is actually Hitler. And once you think Trump is Hitler, and that the Proud Boys aren't just a tiny band of fat white guy losers, and they're 50s who just cosplay, but it's some kind of serious insurrectionary fascist movement. If you get convinced of that, of course you're gonna fucking march behind Neera Tanden and the New York Times and Rachel Maddow and fucking Joe Biden because they convinced you that your only alternative to aligning with them is to succumb to fascism, and it's completely cucked the left. They're total authoritarians now because they believe they're fighting Nazism.
Yeah, I was in Portland for one of those Proud Boy rallies. It was a joke. That's a joke. It is a joke. There are way more cops and spectators than there are people participating in their stupid rally. And then it's just really, anyway, yes, it's, people are, you know what the most amazing thing is they kept saying, Trump is a dictator, Trump is a dictator, Trump is a dictator. And every time he had a chance to consolidate his power, he didn't. Someone else pointed this out, that when the pandemic happened, that would be a time when a dictator would actually consolidate his power. Trump did the exact opposite. Trump said, I'm not handling this, and I'm giving it all over to every governor in the state. So if you're a governor of a state, you handle it.
Trump is a fat, slothful clown. Exactly. He had the perfect pretext with the pandemic. Viktor Orban in Hungary is a fascist. What did he do? He instituted martial law in the name of fighting the pandemic. That's what fascists do. With Trump, the Democrats were complaining he wasn't doing enough. They wanted him to invoke laws that let him seize the means of production in order to produce masks and ventilators, and he did it. He didn't do anything. He never has. He tweets shitty things. That's the full extent of it.
And Glenn, what do you say? We predicted on this show, when I say we, I mean I predicted the day Trump was elected that he would deport less Hispanics than Barack Obama. And my theory was because he puts an ugly face on the horrible stuff that our government has been doing all along. And then now people are going to be aware of our horrible immigration policy. Even though I had been reporting it at this show, the general public had no idea what a monster Barack Obama's administration was when it came to immigrants in the United States, and that he was the deporter in chief, and that he deported more Hispanics than all the presidents combined since 1890. They had no idea of any of this stuff. So I was able to make that prediction pretty confidently. And Jacob Silveros, reporting from MSNBC, just confirmed my prediction that Trump isn't going to come anywhere near close to the deportations that Barack Obama and Joe Biden made in his first term. So what do you say about that? This lesser of two evil voting? I've made the case, Thomas Frank has made the case, that Bill Clinton was not the lesser of two evil. And Barack Obama was, I make the case that Barack Obama was not the lesser of two evil, because the country would not have let Barack Obama take over from George Bush, make his tax cuts permanent, take us from 2 wars to 7, and then make the banks bigger as he kicked 5.1. They would have never let John McCain do that, but they let Barack Obama do it because he was a black guy with a Muslim name. So I don't even know what my question is, but do you want to say anything in this?
Yeah, no, I do. I know what your question is, even if you don't. No, let me tell you this story. This is a really interesting story. So, and it's exactly relevant to what you asked without knowing that you asked. The first time I ever wrote about WikiLeaks was 2008. And I wrote about them because they had published a document that was a document from the Pentagon that was top secret or classified, and WikiLeaks got a hold of it and published it. And what the document said was, it was during 2008 in the summer when Barack Obama was running against McCain. And what the Pentagon was worried about was that there was growing anti-war sentiment in Western Europe. 2 or 3 different governments, I think one in the Netherlands, one in Portugal, had lost in the election because they were participating in the war in Afghanistan, which the Western European populations were turning against. And the Pentagon was petrified that they were going to lose all their allies and be left to rule Afghanistan alone. It was going to be expensive and very difficult. And what they said was, our only hope, you know what their only hope, Jimmy, was for reversing the trend of growing anti-war sentiment in Western Europe? Their best hope? The election of Barack Obama. That's what the Pentagon said. They said, because that will put a much more cosmopolitan, elegant, and pleasant face on this war that up until now had been represented by this like Texan evangelical, Christian evangelical that was kind of anathema to cosmopolitan secular Europeans. Whereas Barack Obama, this like Harvard educated African-American human rights lawyer, he would become the new face of the war on terror, and they would then come to see it as benevolent. And that's exactly what happened. He got in, he continued all those policies, he continued the war in Afghanistan. It became popular again in Western Europe, is there to this very day. The reason they hate Trump is not because he's a horrible person. He is a horrible person. But that doesn't determine what you can do as president, the damage you can do. The reason they hate Trump is because Trump lacks both the willingness and the ability to put that pretty face on American imperialism and corporatism, and to deceive both the domestic population and the international population about what the United States really is. I remember one of the things that they hated the most was when he went on Bill O'Reilly, and Bill O'Reilly asked him about, Putin killing people and why he's not more upset by that. And remember, Trump said, "Oh, you think we're so innocent? We have our own killers," which is like basic standard truth on the left. Like, if you don't know that about the United States, you don't know anything. And they acted like they were so why they were horrified, because the president's not supposed to say the truth about the United States. The president is there to lie through his face, through his behavior, through his comportment. Nothing really changes. Wall Street and the CIA keep running everything. The president is there to kind of manipulate and massage public opinion, and Trump has no ability to do that. That's why they hate him.
That you're exactly 100% right, because it certainly isn't about his policies. That Nancy Pelosi gleefully passed his entire legislative agenda, including giving him money for his border wall. She didn't have to do that. She did it. So this you're right. He puts an ugly face on imperialism, and they just can't have that. And so that's why they got to get it rid of. That's why there's the Lincoln Project. That's why that whole thing. And those guys are just as big a grifters. They're worse than Trump. So that's why I say somebody like Barack Obama had the ability to be more insidious than Donald Trump, because he made you think what he was doing the opposite of what he was doing. When Trump does something, you know he's doing it. Anyway, so Dylan Ratigan said on this show that the United States is sliding into being like Brazil. So I took that to mean that we're going to have a handful of rich people and a bunch of poor people and nobody in the middle. And is that how you take that? And because you're there, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't hear the context. I don't know what he said for sure, but what you just said, he probably said is really interesting and true. It actually, I've lived in this country for 15 years, and there's incredible poverty everywhere. And there always has been, right? That's been one of the things that has shaped Brazilian political culture is extreme levels of wealth and income inequality. And, if you are wealthy or affluent, you get the best of everything, right? You get the best private schools, the best medical care, the best security, the best transportation. There are great doctors and hospitals in Brazil, great everything. But if you're poor, which is the vast majority of the country, you get the worst fucking shit. Your kids don't have clean drinking water. They barely, learn how to speak Portuguese. People who go into the emergency room with heart attacks or strokes wait 6 or 7 hours to be treated and often die because the resources are so poor. They die in hallways. And I remember in the 2018 presidential election when Bolsonaro won, there was a candidate who was a socialist candidate, and he said, people assume Brazil is a poor country because there's so much poverty here. We're not a poor country. We're a rich country. And it's true. Brazil is very rich in natural resources and oil. It's the 6th largest economy in the world. It has a bigger economy than Great Britain and then many other countries which have the reason there's so much poverty is because the distribution of wealth is so lopsided that this huge portion of the population ends up in complete deprivation. That is, the middle class in the United States is disappearing. All those towns that voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, their whole town is boarded up. They have no jobs. They live on opioids to numb the pain. And what did they hear in 2016? You voted for Trump because Russia deceived you. And now you voted for Trump because you're all fucking racist. Even though, Jimmy, the reason Biden won isn't because black people and Hispanics and women rose up in anger over how he treated the marginalized. He lost that voting, those voting sectors. Trump got more than any Republican in many years. He won, Biden did, because of white, affluent suburbanites who work in the professional managerial class and who migrated to the Democratic Party for the first time after voting Republican forever because they know that Democrats are now the party of corporatism. That is the Democratic Party. The centers of power and money on the coast, Silicon Valley and Wall Street, combined with the media and the national security state, and affluent white suburbanites. And yes, black people who have voted for generations, who live in Detroit and Philadelphia and Milwaukee, overwhelmingly will still vote for Democrats if they go to the polls. But increasingly they don't because they don't think it's worth it. So that's how Biden won, through affluent white suburbanites.
So I've been saying on this show, because people are celebrating the Cory Bush and Jamal Bowman being elected as progressives into Congress, and I poured some water on their party by saying they're just going to go there and do whatever Nancy Pelosi tells them to do, exactly like the Squad. Even Bernie Sanders voted for the CARES Act, the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history, without any repercussion. And none of them had to pay a price for it, just like the Iraq War, because if you all are for something, then it's nobody's fault, right? And so I'm making lots of people angry at me because I'm really poo-pooing the idea of taking over the Democratic Party. It's a joke. It's an obvious joke. They'll be able to take over the Democratic Party with progressives about 5 years after we're all dead from climate change. So I've been trying to start a third party. I've been trying to help. But anyway, what do you make? So I say that having people like the Squad inside the Democratic Party in Congress actually hurts progressive causes more than it helps, because it gives the idea to people that there's an opposition party in the United States when you and I know there isn't an opposition party. Nancy Pelosi is the progressives' opposition just as much as Mitch McConnell is, if not more, because it's more insidious, because everybody blue check lefties Hollywood think that Nancy Pelosi actually is on the left. They actually think just like Barack Obama, they actually think he is opposing the corporations and the military. Then they're actually not. They're using her femaleness, just like they use Barack Obama's identity, to do insidious shit. And so what do you say to that? I say it's actually more insidious to have them inside the Democratic Party because it gives the false impression to people that there is an opposition party. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. When I first started, writing about politics, I was part of the liberal blogosphere, and I believed the whole bullshit about how Democrats are basically good people. They just needed some spine, like stiffening, like they're stiffening their spine, that whole like Daily Kos shit.
Yes.
And then the more I watched the Democratic Party, the more I realized what bullshit that was, right? But then I still thought, well, the way to change that is by supporting insurgents. And for a while, I actually believed that. And I listened to this story in 2018, in June. Ryan Grimm, who is the Washington bureau chief of The Intercept and a good friend of mine, and I think a great reporter, messaged me, and he's like, "Hey, there's this woman running in Queens against this shitty incumbent who's just hasn't been to the district in 20 years. One of those guys, just he's a lot really powerful, but nobody knows him. That in those back rooms of the Capitol where everything gets done." And he said, "I think you'd really like her." And I was like, "Ryan, I'm not interested in supporting Democratic candidates." He's like, "No, just look at her and talk to her." And it was AOC. And I looked at her Twitter feed, and it was that week she had said, the Israelis had killed a bunch of Gazans, and she went onto Twitter and she said, "The oppression of Palestinians is a human rights issue. You can't pretend you care about human rights in the United States and racism in the United States if you support Israel, and I'm sick of people in my own party." And I was like, wow, right? She's running for Congress in fucking New York City saying, "I'm sick of Democrats supporting Israel." I was like, all right, I'm interested in her. And I went and then I interviewed her. It was you can see it on YouTube. It was 250,000 people watched, however many. And I really was impressed with her. I asked her about identity politics, and she said, this is a Trojan horse. They get Black and Latino candidates who pretend to be liberal, but they're really, just there to give the appearance of diversity, but it's not real diversity. She said, I asked her if she won, if she would support Pelosi and Hoyer for leadership. And she said, absolutely not. They've been there too long. We need new leadership. I won't vote for them. She fucking wins. What does she do? She gets to Congress. The first thing she does is she votes for Pelosi and Hoyer, of course. And then she fires her staff that's too critical of the Democratic Party. And she basically turns into a good soldier for she now calls Pelosi Mama Bear. And most of what she does is identity politics. Yes. Now, let me just say two things. One is that I get why people do identity politics in her position, because to take on true power centers, to take on Wall Street, to take on the CIA, to take on the Israel lobby, it's really hard. It's not easy. You're going to get fucking attacked if you do that from every direction, with money, with everything. And it's complicated and it's difficult work to make any progress. But identity politics, that's so easy. You denounce racism, you talk about genocide, I want this statute down. So you get to feel you're at least doing shit, right? It's just kind of a psychological easy path. So Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, and they probably have more left-wing politics than the standard Democratic caucus on things that matter, but they're going to get there, and they know that if they try and do any of that, they're going to get crushed.
Yes.
The only space they're going to get is culture war stuff, because the Democratic Party loves that stuff, because you feel you're changing things when you're actually changing nothing. Now, let me say one other thing. I have a little bit more sympathy for this dilemma, because my husband is in Congress. He's now a politician. In 2016, he was elected to the Rio City Council. In 2018, he went to Congress as a member of Congress, and he's in an actual socialist party. And I know the compromises that you get faced with, like he'll have a bill that he thinks will improve the lives of the people that he grew up with in the slums. And they'll come to him and say, we'll let your bill on the floor for a vote if you vote for our shitty, corrupt, lobbyist crap that, will give money to. And then you can say, no, fuck you. I'm going to stand on principle. I'm not going to help these people because I'm not willing to get my hands dirty with your sleazy bill. Or you say, okay, I'll play ball with you. And then the more you make those compromises, suddenly you're part of that game. So I agree with you completely. But it's different in Brazil because there's 26 different political parties. There's not just two. So if you're in one of those parties that's with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, you just fucking leave and go to a different party like he did. With a two-party system, if you stay in the Democratic Party, your only choice is going to be to succumb to it. You're going to be a fucking good soldier, the way Bernie is, the way AOC is. You're going to get behind Biden and Kamala, and they're going to let you for a couple months, talk a good game every now and then. But they know at the end of the day, you're going to snap into line. And if you don't, you're not going to get anything. So, yeah, I don't see how that kind of reform is possible within the party. I really don't. I wish I did, and for a long time I did. But I've concluded, and AOC was kind of my last hope.
Yeah, me too. So when I saw her vote for the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of the human race, and Bernie also voted for it, and then basically lied to his supporters about it and about what he did. He pretended that he got the unemployment insurance in that bill. He did not. That was Michael Bennet. That was straight up fucking gaslighting from the left to protect them for doing something corrupt. So when they voted for the CARES Act, it's my position that was corrupt. That was what happened in 2008 when Barack Obama was president. They figured out how to do it. It took months for them to get that extract wealth upward. They figured out how to do it in fucking 2 weeks. And they got it done, man. And not one opposition, not one voice against it. Not only Bernie Sanders could have voted against it, and then people would have asked him, why did you vote against it? And then people would know why there's 10,000 people in a food line in Texas today because of the CARES Act. But now, since Bernie Sanders voted for it, and every member of the squad, nobody's going to be held accountable for it. Nobody's going to be held accountable for voting for the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of the human race because they all did it. And with that, and what I said is that it's bad. Bernie Sanders went from being a passive, a spineless, a willing tool of the establishment to actually doing evil. When you voted for that thing, which he didn't have to vote for, it would have passed anyway. He's now actually giving the impression to people in the country that this had to be done. It's a good thing. And what the CARES Act really was a piece of cheese inside of a trap, and we took the cheese, and now our head is inside that trap. And that's why there's 10,000 people in food lines in Texas and every other part of the goddamn country, and people are living under every bridge in California, a state that is supermajority Democrat with a Democrat governor. No one will ever be held accountable for the CARES Act, Glenn. And it's because most of the people in journalism don't even fucking know what it was, what is in it, or what the ramifications are. When they see 10,000 people in a food line, they don't make the connection to the CARES Act, Nancy Pelosi, and every member of the federal government voting for this. So I'll stop talking. You talk.
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't know what broke in the matrix on that day, but you remember when Nancy Pelosi was on CNN and Wolf Blitzer was actually asking her in a pretty persistent manner. Like I said, something broke in the matrix, or that cassette that's in Wolf Blitzer's back was malfunctioning, and he was asking her real questions about why it was that she was holding up this aid for people when they were starving. I remember she was like, she got really sarcastic, and she's like, thank you so much for your concern for our we know them. We know. And then he said, well, no, I am concerned because I see them on the street asking for money for food. And she said, we feed them. Do you feed them? We feed them. It was such a mass dropping moment because it's it's such Marie Antoinette behavior, right? It's that kind of, we sit inside the walls of power in our castle, and we ride by the poor people in our golden carriages, and we throw them crumbs occasionally. And that's all they need. And they should be happy with that. And that's what the CARES Act was. I think the problem, though, with seeing all of that I don't know in each individual case which of these two motives was driving them, but I know that it was one of the two, and maybe in some cases both. Either they felt like they really were going to get something for their good behavior. They were going to get a little biscuit. Like Bernie was going to get some kind of cabinet position, or sexual leftist was going to be influenced. I think they really convinced. You see these Warren people. They're like, oh my God, you're not going to make her Secretary of Treasury. Of course he's not going to fucking make Elizabeth Warren secretary. Did you actually think that? You actually thought that was going to happen? Did you start watching the Democrats, last Thursday? So I think some of these people really believe. I think she stayed in Super Tuesday and fucked Bernie because she thought she was going to get a position. And of course they're not. You see who they're giving their positions to, like every lobbyist, every sleazebag corporate, exactly the people you would expect. Republicans, warmongers. I think it's that, and I also think it's and it's what happened to me at The Intercept too. It's inside liberal culture, it's so insular. They only talk to one another, and this idea that Trump was this unprecedented historic evil that you cannot do anything to endanger or impede the Democrats in every way. All your obligation as a human being to do for the next year is to just be obedient and stand behind Joe Biden and the Democrats, no matter what they tell you to do, and not utter a peep, because if you do, you'll risk reelecting Trump. The cultural pressure of that was so immense that even if they didn't believe they were going to get any biscuits or cookies at the end for their obedience, they were just too scared to step out of line.
AOC gave a speech on the floor calling out the Republicans. She pretending like it was the Republicans passing the CARES Act that was transferring $5 trillion of wealth upward, when it was Nancy Pelosi who was in charge of the Congress, which is why we voted them in 2018, so we could have some control. And of course, she wasn't allowed to call out Nancy Pelosi, but she did say what we're getting in this bill is crumbs and it's the Republicans' fault, which is just gaslight. Now you're just a partisan liar. You're the exact opposite of why we elected. We elected you to stand up to Nancy Pelosi. We elected you to stand up to the corruption inside the Democratic Party, and all she's there is doing is
we already had Joe Crowley. There was already a Democrat in that seat who was loyal to Nancy Pelosi. No one needed her to go and be oh, the Republicans suck, the Republicans. And you're so right. There is this leftist case. I'm not saying I'm convinced by it, that it would be better if Joe Crowley was in that position, because at least with him, you know what you were getting. With her, it's people are oh, if I'm a leftist and I'm a cool socialist leftist, the Democratic Party is the place for me, because she's telling me that's the place where you come do cool left-wing subversive socialism, which of course is a complete deceit. It's a complete deceit. It's total false advertising.
Well, I've caught a lot of heat for making that point on this show. We catch a lot of heat from everybody. I've been called sexist for doing that. I've been called racist for doing that. That I'm picking on women of color because I'm making that observation. So, kudos to you for having the balls to do that too. Hey, everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.